This is what victory looks like to the Ukrainian army. The city of Irpin, next to the capital Kiev, has been effectively retaken from the Russians, but swathes of it are destroyed. Retreating Russian forces are accused of using phosphorus in the process. Last night, Kiev saw one of the biggest explosions yet when Russia blew up an oil depot. At his daily press conference in Moscow, General Igor boasted of the type of missile they used. But the most dramatic news from Russia slipped out of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, saying now most of the objectives of phase 1 of what they call their special military operation are complete, and Russia will concentrate on taking full control of Donbass in the east, much of which was taken in 2014. It might also explain why taking Mariupol at all costs was so important.
Последствия обстрелов драмтеатров. Ракета попала прямо в центр драмтеатра. Сейчас люди пытаются эвакуироваться.
The first images have emerged from inside the theatre just after the bombing on March the 16th. The Mariupol authorities have revised their estimate of the dead, today saying they believe around 300 people were killed here. If confirmed, it would be by far the worst single atrocity of the war. The UN Human Rights Team says there are now a number of mass graves in Mariupol, including one appearing to hold around 200 bodies. They're now investigating claims of Russian soldiers killing civilians in their cars as they tried to flee.
Today, without food, water and medicine, civilians are dying every day. People are buried in common graves. Corpses lie on the streets of the city. There is not one to bury them. People are hiding in cellars burning before you. They die starvation, dehydration and disease.
If Russia is now concentrating on taking Donbass, they have stepped up attacks on the biggest city in their way, Kharkiv. This was the bombing last night. It followed this attack on a queue for humanitarian aid. There were 6 civilians reported killed and 15 injured. Vladimir Putin injected a bizarre level of culture war into the real war, claiming the West was trying to cancel Russia like J.K. Rowling.
Не так давно отменили детского писателя Джоан Роулинг за то, что она, автор книг, которые разошлись по миру сотнями миллионов экземпляров, не угодила поклонникам так называемых гендерных свобод.
Joe Biden rounded off his European trip by heading to the Poland-Ukraine border. To much surprise, he told American troops they would soon be in Ukraine. Was it a slip or a prediction of the war being over soon?
The average citizen, look at how they're stepping up. Look at how they're stepping up. And you're going to see when you're there, and some of you have been there, you're going to see women, young people standing in the middle of front of a damn tank.
Russian forces were filmed with a priest today, hearing confession by the battlefield. In Moscow, they claimed the number of soldiers killed so far was 1,351, a fraction of what Ukraine and NATO claim. But with Moscow's new war aim of taking Donbass now announced, their negotiating position is effectively on the table. Well, in the south, Ukraine's military says it has been making gains against the Russians. Russian forces came close to the outskirts of the southern city of Mykolaiv, but have now been pushed back. Our chief correspondent, Alex Thompson, spent the day in Mykolaiv before returning to Odessa, Ukraine's major port on the Black Sea.
The Mykolaiv soundtrack, the place awarded hero status by the Ukrainian government this week. The last city defending Odessa from Moscow. And Ukrainian soldiers here have beaten back successive Russian assaults. And now emerging from the Mykolaiv front, audio intercepts. Russian soldiers telling Putin's war as they see it.
Я тебе скажу, здесь 200-х отправить не могли нормально. Они с нами дней 5 катались. Даже в Чечне в свое время такого не было. Намного было, хоть ясно было. Тут такой трэш. Я говорю, нас свой самолет авиабомбы скинул. Думали, что как на параде проедем, оно оказалось. Да. У нас задача была на Николаев идти, все, короче, пока Николаев стоим.
Defiance, they say it with flowers, staying open amid the bloodshed when most business has shut down. Mykolaiv mechanics weld statement vehicles. Ukrainian resistance, the world's most cut-through national brand. Streets sandbagged with petrol bombs ready. But the cost. 2 people were killed here, civilians, in a housing terrace. Fire crews are still damping down the rubble.
Stanislav, is there any possible reason why this could be considered a legitimate military target for a missile?
In a range from 1 to 1.5 kilometers from here, there's no military infrastructure. This is just residential housing.
Across town, another residential block, again nowhere near any military target. Mercifully empty, nobody hurt. We move again to, of all places, Regional Psychiatric Hospital number 1. The missile parachute hangs over the crater. Murals in a place of care and nurture.
With all the modern surveillance systems available, it is hard to imagine how anybody could target, of all things, a psychiatric hospital and thereby imperil the lives of the most vulnerable people imaginable. But that's what happened here. And everybody here has stressed to us this morning there were no military installations anywhere near this place when the missile came in.
These destroyed hospital buildings were empty at the time, but miraculously alive and unhurt. Tatiana Haiduk was just across the courtyard at home as the missile detonated.
As if an earthquake, the floor and the walls jumped up, and then it all fell down. Shards of glass fell on me. Dust, dirt, soot. We couldn't understand what happened.
How long will it take?
The regional governor baffled by Russia's inexplicably chaotic approach to warfare.
Tonight we have more than 10 missiles hit at Nikolaev, only Nikolaev, and the targets are very unusual. So I do not know what are they doing. Maybe they're trying to put our city in chaos or our citizens to be afraid of them. I do not know.
Last night, Governor Kim filmed this, what he says is Ukrainian artillery pounding Russian positions to the south. And today he told me they could retake Kherson, which is in this direction, the only major city Russia has seized.
Well, taking up that theme, that suggestion, it was only that they could possibly envisage retaking Kherson. I didn't expect to get an answer on that because a military strategist would never talk about those sorts of things in the midst of a raging war. But he did say that, and in the last hour, the New York Times reporting Pentagon sources say, the Pentagon this is, saying they believe that, quote, the Russians are no longer in full control of Kherson. Remember, it's the only town of any size the Russians have seized in this entire war. Critically positioned on the march west, as the Kremlin would have it, Kherson and then Mykolaiv and then westwards to the ultimate supposed prize, Odessa, the biggest port in Ukraine, of course. Tonight doesn't look as if that's happening. Now, we don't know what's happening precisely in Kherson. I have to say that Ukrainians in the city still say the Russians are firmly in control. The Kremlin certainly say that, but, well, they would, wouldn't they?
Alex Thompson. Well, a little earlier I spoke to retired Czech Army General and former chairman of the NATO Military Committee, Petr Pavel, and I began by asking him about Russia potentially changing its war aims now from conquering the whole country to just taking the Donbass.
Well, apparently Russian regime have to find some explanation or some narrative of success. They need something to end the war, but end it and describe it as a victory. One could be a land bridge between Crimea and Donbass. Another might be taking the whole area of Donbass and keeping other areas that they have occupied recently. They simply need something to be portrayed as a victory.
Now, of course, Joe Biden isn't in charge, but when asked what would be the response to a chemical weapons attack from Russia, he said there would be a response in kind.
Well, what I learned from the summit that NATO obviously sees use of mass destruction weapons as a kind of a red line, and that they are ready to support Ukraine with all necessary capabilities to face such an attack. Of course, NATO can provide some capabilities to Ukrainian military to be more efficient in facing such an attack, with the exception of nuclear. I believe that if Russia uses nuclear weapons, that would be a general red lines, not only for NATO, but also for other countries. I believe that China and India wouldn't tolerate it as well.
I mean, you mentioned the use of nuclear weapons as a red line. Again, people will wonder, well, what would be the response? Would the response be outside Ukraine? Because if it were, then that's a full-scale war with Russia.
Well, of course, once Russia decides to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, even in a limited strike or a tactical nuclear weapon, that would be crossing a red line, and it would make conflict much broader than just Russia-Ukraine. And the West would have to react. If that reaction would be the same, or if it would be by different means, it's obviously up to the decision of NATO countries, but they would have to react. They cannot simply let it go, because use of nuclear weapons in a conflict would mean entirely new security situation globally.
Do you think this now looks like a long war?
I don't expect that the war will be so long, because it consumes tremendous resources on both sides. And if there is no major success on the ground, it would apparently lead to a negotiating table, because if neither side cannot achieve a victory, then protecting the war, inflicting more and more casualties and more damage wouldn't make any sense for Russia and nor for Ukraine.